We went from Genesis to First Kings. We've talked about two kings so far, David and Solomon, and First Kings talks about building the temple, about Solomon and kings that come after him. Second Kings is a really fun book to read if you've never read it. It's a really kind of jaw dropper. We read about a prophet Elijah, and we read about Elisha. We read about Elijah's fiery departure into heaven. We read about Elisha healing a man of leprosy named Naaman. In chapter 6, that's where we're going to be tonight. I'm not going to read this part of it, but we read about an axe head, a heavy axe head that Elisha called to float, and it floated. You read about Hezekiah's prayer of deliverance from Assyria. You read about the young king Josiah in the latter part, and then it ends with the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile in 2 Kings chapter 25. But tonight, I want to focus on a story. It's 2 Kings chapter 6. I'm going to read verses 8 through 23. It's a really neat story, and if I had to title it, I would just say there's more than meets the eye. Sometimes we forget that there is more than meets the eye. Imagine a soldier in battle. He's outnumbered and surrounded. He's scared. It looks like it's going to be just a doomsday slaughter. Yet right before he charges into the fight, somebody taps him on the shoulder. He turns around, and when he turns around, there's a group of military advisors pointing out the enemy's weaknesses and providing strategic insights that turn the tide of the battle. That soldier had no idea that help was there all along, and the victory was already secured before he even knew it. He was scared for nothing. Just like that soldier, every one of us, we face times in our lives where there is a spiritual battle or a physical battle. We face time in our lives where we feel alone, we feel overwhelmed, and sometimes we forget that God and His armies are right behind us, that He's working right behind the scenes, protecting and guiding us even when we cannot see it. There is more than meets the eye. And 2 Kings chapter 6, the king of Aram, that's Syria, is at war with Israel. God reveals the plan of the enemy to Elisha, leading to strategic victories for Israel. The passage we're going to read in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 23, describes one such event where Elisha's servant, who we don't really know who that is, fears the advancing Aramean army. But Elisha knows there's more than meets the eye, and he sees the protection of God Almighty. It starts one way, and it ends very different than you would think. So let me read it. Let me talk about it after I read the whole passage. It says in verse 8, "Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servants, saying, 'My camp will be in such and such a place.' And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, 'Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there.' Then the king of Israel sent someone to the place of which the man of God had told him. Thus he warned him, and he was watchful there, not just once or twice. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled by this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, 'Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?' And one of his servants said, 'None, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom.' So he said, 'Go and see where he is, that I may send and get him.' And it was told him, saying, 'Surely he is in Dothan.' Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there. And they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, 'Alas, my master, what shall we do?' The servant of Elisha, he's scared. And this is what Elisha says in verse 16. So he answered, 'Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. Now Elisha said to them, this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. So it was when they had come to Samaria that Elijah said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and they were inside Samaria. Can you imagine? Like, how do we get here? Verse 21, now when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, my father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? This guy was ready to take vengeance. But in verse 22, but he answered, you shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set food and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. Then he prepared a great feast for them, and after they ate and drank, he sent them away, and they went to their master. So the bands of Syrian raiders came no more to the land of Israel. It's a very, very neat story to me, at least. I see a lot of biblical truths in here, but tonight I just want to focus, like I said, there's more than meets the eye. One thing we see is that there's a threat of an enemy here. We see the enemy's strategy here. Aram's king, Syria's king, he's frustrated, as Israel always knows his plans. God reveals the enemy's secrets to Elisha, highlighting God's omnipresence, I guess I would say, and his care for his people. Then you see the enemy's target in verses 11 through 14. The king of Aram sends a large army to capture Elisha and Dothan. It's a demonstration of God's work is often under threat by visible, physical forces. If you're doing the Lord's work, if you're doing what God tells you to do, when he tells you to do it, if God is blessing, it should not surprise you that you will have enemies pop up in this life. As a matter of fact, I would argue that if you're not encountering any spiritual warfare, if you're not encountering any resistance, then you're not being a very good soldier. You're not a soldier whom the enemy is threatened by. Think of a thief who breaks into a house. He's cautious, he's sneaky, trying to avoid detection. But what the thief doesn't know is that the house has a high-tech security system connected to the police who are monitoring every moment. While the thief believes he's in control, God's already aware of the danger, and he already has set a plan in motion. When you're doing the Lord's work like Elisha was doing, I mean, he's bringing up axe heads. He knows everything that's going on. Elisha and God are one-on-one. It's frustrating to the enemy. Same thing when you're doing the Lord's work, when you're serving him in any part of ministry at all, whether it's in the church or outside the church. The enemy is going to try to sneak into your life. He's going to try to plant seeds of fear, seeds of doubt. He's going to try to plot against you. And it may not always be spiritual. It could very well be physical things. But God sees everything. We may not always understand how, but God is always aware of the enemy's plans and is working to protect us. So remember tonight, we often face threats from the enemy in life, whether spiritual, emotional, physical, but God's not unaware of that. This passage shows that. It also shows that the enemy is often working behind the scenes, but God sees and knows all. If we're looking at two people in the story, if I'm being honest, if I'm being completely and 100% honest, I look at Elisha and I look at the servant. And I ask you tonight, which one are you more likely to be? Are you more likely to be Elisha, who sits there and looks at the army? Or are you more likely to be the servant in verse 15, who sees the army surrounding and says, my master, what shall we do? What are we going to do? This is bad. Elisha's servant wakes up and he sees the enemy surrounding the city. He only sees the physical reality. But in verses 16 through 17, Elisha says, "Listen, servant, don't be afraid, because those who are with us are more than those who are with them." I could just imagine what this guy must have been thinking. He probably looked around, looked to his left and looked to his right, and was like, "Elisha, I love you, but what are you talking about?" So Elisha prays, and after he prays, the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And what's amazing about this story, I didn't even write about it in my notes, but what I think about it, they're here, they're on guard, they're ready to go, but from what I read, nobody died in battle at all. They were just there just in case. There is more than meets the eye. Imagine a hunter or a hiker that's going through a forest at night. You ever been in that situation? I remember when I was little, and it ain't changed a whole lot since I've got older. Every noise, every rustling of leaves feels like danger. And it grows because you can't see what's around you. But maybe when the blindfold's taken off or the sun comes up, you see you're on a well-worn path and the danger is only in your imagination. Well, like the servant in this passage, how many times do we feel overwhelmed and afraid because we only see the immediate danger? We only see the physical realities around us. But if we could only open our spiritual eyes to see God's presence, we would realize that His protection is much greater than any threat around us. When you're facing an overwhelming situation, I'm not going to say if, I say when. It might be the death of a loved one. It might be what Dustin's friend's going through with her boy. It's so easy to focus on just the immediate danger. But I tell you, God's presence is far greater than what we see. Faith involves seeing beyond the physical world to spiritual reality. That's a pretty awesome story if we stop there, but after he sees all this, what ends up happening in verse 18, you see the blindness of the enemy. You see God's supernatural protection. God steps in a supernatural way. Elisha prays for the enemy to be struck with blindness, and it happens. To me, it's a reminder of God's ability to blind and confuse the enemy as part of His protection for His people. You also see God's guidance and God's provision in verses 19 through 20. Elisha leads the blind army into Samaria, the capital of Israel, where their sight is restored. Instead of attacking, Israel shows mercy and provides a feast, sending them back home. It's not the way I would have done it if I was the Lord. If I was the Lord, I'd probably would have just wiped everybody out. But remember, God's protection often includes supernatural intervention in ways we can't predict or control. When God protects us, His plans can also turn our enemies into instruments of His mercy. Through this example, these people saw the merciful God we serve. The outcome, you could see in verse 21, the king had a dilemma. It says, "Now when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elijah, 'My father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them?'" He was ready to go at it. But Elisha instructs him not to harm them. Instead of retaliation, Elisha instructs the king to prepare a feast for the enemy soldiers, showing mercy rather than vengeance. And after the feast, the Arameans, if I'm saying that right, they return to their land and peace prevails. Our God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. But in the New Testament, we see a picture of this over and over and over again, where God says, look, show your enemy mercy. Even in the Old Testament, you see David and Saul. David could have killed Saul, but he showed him mercy. And Saul breaks down and says, you've shown me more kindness than you've ever shown me. Sometimes mercy is the way to go. Imagine a judge, after hearing the evidence of a crime, realizes that a person who committed it had a difficult past and acted out of desperation. Instead of giving the harshest sentence, the judge chooses mercy, offering a second chance. The criminal is moved by this act of grace and promises to change, leading to transformation of their life. We hear that kind of story, we see that kind of stuff happens, and we don't like it. I don't like it. I'm one of those, you do the crime, you do the time. But here's the difference between an elected judge and the great judge. Our judge is a perfect judge, and he don't make mistakes. If our judge tells us to show mercy, we should listen, and this story shows that God's right all the time. God's ways often involve mercy instead of judgment. Just as Elisha led Israel to show mercy to their enemies, God calls us to respond with grace to those who might oppose or hurt us. And mercy, while it seems like a wimpy way out or not the strong way out, mercy has the power to change hearts and bring about peace. It did here, and it still does today. God's ways are different than our natural impulses. Instead of seeking vengeance, God calls us to extend mercy. When we trust in God's protection, we leave room for His work in the lives of others, even our enemies. There's more than meets the eye. God's protection is about more than just physical safety. It's a reminder that He is sovereign over all things, and His ways are higher than our ways. David Jeremiah wrote a book a few years ago, and I couldn't find it in my office right away. I might have lent it to somebody. It's a book about angels. And the Honduras team, we're getting ready to go to Honduras, so I thought it'd be a good way to share tonight. This was a story about a missionary that lived overseas, and he was serving in a very, very dangerous area. I believe, if I remember right, it was just him and his wife. They had a house. He was working with some tribes, kind of like Jim Elliot was way back when, and word had gotten to the tribes, and they were going to come and kill these missionaries that night. The missionary and his wives heard about it. I don't know if they got on the phone or what happened, but right there in that room, they prayed that night fervently that God would protect them and that it would work out. Well, surprisingly, nothing happened. Morning came. Nothing happened. They just knew, they got confirmed reports they were going to be attacked that night. Well, as time goes on and years progresses, God was good to the missionary. And God led to the hearts of these really pagan, really evil people being converted. And years later, that missionary had a conversation with one of the tribe leaders. And he says, I just got to know, many years ago, me and my wife got a report that you were coming to kill us. And he goes, I want to know what happened that night. Did you change your mind? Did you get stuck? Because I feel like God did something, so I really want to know what happened. And he said, yeah, we came, and we got to the door, but we wasn't about to attack you because you had all these people around you. And the guy was like, huh? He goes, yeah, we were there, and your cottage was surrounded. It looked like you were surrounded by an army. It was almost the exact same story we just read about tonight. There's more than meets the eye. When Paul says in Romans, if God be for us, then who can be against us? What you see is far different than what the Lord sees. And I promise you, there is spiritual warfare going on, but greater is He who is in me, who is around me, who is in you, than he who is in the world. That's not changed, and it never, ever will. I can't wait for the day that I kind of get a glimpse into what's going on around us. But until then, we'll just have to read stories like this and the Bible to know that there's more than meets the eye. So y'all come back Sunday, bring a friend, pray for Zach, pray for the Honduras team. We'll be in church down there. Maybe we'll get to see a baptism again. I don't know. But y'all stay warm this week. I'm going to ask Brother Harry to please dismiss us tonight.